by the business sector to say, basically, what are you guys up to, if I may use a colloquialism, and that those interactions also would have been a channel through which business and others could express their concerns about what actually happened. Now, one will have to have a researcher to work out which particular set of events eventually resulted in what happened on the evening of the 13th of December. But clearly, some of the senior colleagues and comrades within the ANC ranks were very aware of the consequences of what was going on, and would have evaluated the different types of feedback that they were receiving, and then decided to, it would appear, approach the President on this matter. It was a fairly unique event, if you like, in our more recent past, where you have this kind of turmoil following a political decision.
Well, I was about to ask whether you are able to indicate whether maybe post-94, whether there had ever been any event to which the markets reacted so negatively in the country. You might or might not be able to say so, but let me ask.
Not with any great authority, Chair, but I would doubt it. So some of the big events we've had, if you like, is the introduction of gear during President Mandela's term, the Asian financial crisis in 98, 99, which also Minister Manuel and others had to deal with, the departure in 2008 of President Mbeki and his replacement by President Motlanthe would have been another one. But in each of those situations, I would imagine the kind of turmoil and concerns that were expressed in this context would not have been seen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, do you know of any other senior members of the ANC who would have acted similarly to how you acted, as you described now?
Yeah, well, eventually, as my narrative continues, you will see that the current president, Mr. Ramaphosa, and the Deputy Secretary General certainly got involved. I think the Secretary General himself, Mr. Mantashe, was involved in some way. The Treasurer General of the time, Mr. Mkhize, and one or two other cabinet colleagues might have been involved as well.
We'll get to that narrative in a moment. And do you know of any senior members of the governing party who were approached by business, formally or informally? I know it's a very general question and a difficult question to answer.
I think some of the names I've mentioned might have had interactions with business. But there was no doubt that the business sector, and perhaps you should call them as well and ask them directly. If you take the financial institutions, the leadership of business organizations at the time, how did they experience this period? So they can tell you what their concerns were and what were the measures or reactions that came from their particular constituencies in respect of this matter, because there certainly were engagements, but it could mean that one ANC person met 5 business people on one occasion, another met another 10 people on another occasion, or whatever the case might be. My tendency is to stay away, not to, if you like, poke my nose into those matters unless I have to. So I've declared the manner in which I've expressed my concern at that particular time. But there's no doubt that there was a hyperactivity during that weekend.
The estimated impact on the South African economy in financial terms, what was that over that weekend beginning 9 December 2015?
Well, in paragraph 79, Chair, we give you some indication of numbers. And this is not the weekend, this is just 2 business days, Thursday and Friday, the 10th and the 11th. of December 2015. And what we say here is the devastating impact of this unexpected announcement on the South African economy is estimated to be approximately 500 billion rands. This covers the following two amounts. As commentators and market analysts had described over 2 days, the market value of the country's 17 biggest financial and property shares fell by 290 billion rands. So if you tried to extract your pensions at that point in time, the value of the investments, which is normally around 60% in shares, for most pension funds, would have dropped quite substantially, as this number is indicating. This figure excludes the remainder of the equities market that also was hit hard by the decision. And then the South African bonds lost 12% of their capital value, and that amounted to the 216 billion number. We've deleted the last sentence of paragraph 79, but when checking with Bloomberg, from the 9th of December in the evening to the 11th of December, if we track the rand, Chairperson.
Can I refer you in that regard to page 140 of the supplementary bundle, where the calculations of your legal team are set out? That's bundle N.
What's the page number?
140. Bundle N2.
N2.
Yes, Chair. They should now be marked. It's the supplementary bundle.
I've got the supplementary bundle, but it doesn't go, or does go as far as
Right towards the back, Chairperson.
you said 142, eh?
140.
140. Oh, okay, I've got it.
Yes, Minister.
No, thank you for directing me to this page. So, Chair, as you see there, on Wednesday, the 9th of December, at 8 in the evening, the rand was trading at 14.59 to the dollar, US dollar. The announcement of Mr. Van Rooyen's appointment was made at 11 in the evening of the 9th. On the 10th at midnight, the rand was at 15.25. Then the average for, the 10th was 15.27, and on the 11th, it was 15.90. So clearly, if that pattern is to be followed, there would be a further deterioration on Monday of the 14th, if we use that just as one of the indicators.
Would you then please deal with the events of Sunday, the 13th of December 2015, and your interaction with the former president in particular?
I'm sorry. Before Mr. Pretorius directed you to the page we have just dealt with in the other bundle, you were saying something in regard to the last sentence of paragraph 79. I just want to make sure that I understand. I think you have completed it, but I just want to make sure, because you were referring to the last sentence of paragraph 79.
I was reminding ourselves, Chair, that yesterday, as part of corrections, what stood as the last sentence previously, the rand depreciated sharply, was deleted.
Oh, that
So the new numbers on page 140
Okay.
of the bundle replaces those numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Then, if you will, Minister Gordhan, would you deal with the events of Sunday, 13 December 2015, and in particular your interactions with the former president?
So in paragraph 81, Chair, perhaps if I may, with your permission, round up the last part, what does that
Yes.
impact mean for the South African public? And I indicated that one of the impacts for working people who save their pensions, money in various forms of pension funds or other forms of investments, and usually there's 50 to 60% of that put into the equity markets or shares, as we call them, there would have been a substantial decline in the value of those shares and therefore the value of the pension. What we don't have here, but which your team could get, Chairperson, is the drop in the value of the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation investments at the time as well. That was also a very good indicator. I think they lost 50 billion or something in a day, if not more. But I don't want to swear by that. But it's a number that your team could check with the PIC itself. So for so-called ordinary South Africans, the first impact is on their savings. The second is that if that turmoil continued, then pretty much as we see today, even if oil prices are fairly static, and if the rand begins to head in this sort of direction of 15, 19, 90, 16 rand, 16.50, then, and as you know, we import our oil largely, except for what Sasol produces. That means the price of petrol and diesel is a cost that the citizen has to pay, as we've learned over the past few months as well. If that continues for a substantial enough period, these price increases then filter into the economy more generally. Transport costs increase, and if you talk to the Reserve Bank, they could give you their perspective on this as well. And their perspective would be whether these price increases then begin to impact on the inflation rate. And if they do, then you could get an increase in the interest rates. And if you do, then the money that you've borrowed for your car or for your home or whatever the case might be is a lot more expensive than you originally thought. So you could have borrowed at 10% to 12%, and suddenly it shoots up by 0.5% or whatever the case is. And depending on the value of your loan, it becomes an additional burden, this increase in interest rates as well. So you can see how this economic cycle works. And I'm an amateur at that, but I'm sure you can get a professional to come and explain to you what the impact is. So it affects ordinary South Africans, these sorts of decisions that we make. And obviously the kind of concern shown by different constituencies during that critical weekend of the 12th and 13th was absolutely justified. And I'm not saying that my appointment was justified. I'm just saying the concern was justified. But we'll come back to that in a moment.
Well, you might wish to deal with this maybe later on after you have dealt with the events of Sunday the 13th and maybe even Monday. But I do want to know whether that kind of lost value in terms of pensions and so on would be recovered or recouped as soon as the rand came back, or whether in terms of economics and finances it would necessarily be like that, and whether after some time from that time, whatever value had been lost during that weekend has actually been rectified. So, but it's a question you can deal with when it fits into what you want to talk about.
Sure. Only safe to add, Chair, that the immediate attention in these sorts of situations is given to stabilizing the environment so that the trough doesn't continue, you plateau at some level, and then the recovery process starts. But again, if your team speaks to the Joburg Stock Exchange, for example, they'll give you the actual numbers of the time and what the recovery takes. Okay. So coming back to Sunday, the 13th of December 2015, as I indicate in paragraph 81, in the late afternoon of Sunday, the 13th of December 2015, I received a message from Ms. Kaunda requesting my attendance at a meeting with former President Zuma to be held at Mashlamba and Ndlovu later that evening. At around the same time, Ms. Jessie Duarte, the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, contacted me explaining that I was going to be asked to do something by former President Zuma. As I recall it, no detail was given to me, and that I should not refuse the request.
You say no detail was given, Minister. Was
Yes.
she told what you would be asked to do, or were you told?
Well, retrospectively, yes.
But at this stage?
All I was told is, please don't refuse. They must have known that I was enjoying my job at Kokta, but we'll come back to that. I received a similar message from the Deputy President of the ANC and of the country at the time, Mr. Ramaphosa.
Again, were you given any detail?
No detail. Safe to say that please don't refuse. I believe Ms. Duarte and then Deputy President Ramaphosa had met with former President Zuma over the weekend regarding his surprise removal of Mr. Nene and the appointment of Mr. Van Rooyen. I arrived at the President's residence at about 18:30, as I indicate in paragraph 85. And at 85:1,
Sorry, again, before you go on, Minister, was anyone else present at that meeting?
no, it was just, well, in the room itself, only the two of us. He had his staff outside of the room. During that conversation, former President Zuma indicated that he was of the view that Mr. Van Rooyen was suitable for the finance minister position. I think he said he checked his CV with various people, and he seemed to be fine. And I continue with paragraph 85:1. So let me just read it again. During the conversation, former President Zuma indicated that he was of the view that Mr. Van Rooyen was suitable for the finance minister position, but others felt that the turmoil when the markets reopened on Monday could be even more serious if Mr. Van Rooyen was retained than that experienced the previous Thursday and Friday. That would be the 10th and 11th of December.
Did he tell you, Minister, who those others were?
No.
Yes, please continue.
85:2, former President Zuma indicated that he wanted me to take up the position in order to calm the markets. 85:3, I responded that there were other qualified individuals that the former president could consider for the job, such as Mr. Jonas, and Tabisi Jonas, and Mr. Jabu Moleketi, who was the former finance minister. The former president then indicated that neither of these suggestions were acceptable to him and that he thought I should accept the position. In fact, he said, well, the people he's been speaking to say, I'm the one who can calm the markets. I don't know what magic I have, but that was the comment that was made.
But you had been Minister of Finance before.
I suppose so. At paragraphs 86...
Before you go on, Minister, in that conversation with the former president, were any requirements placed on your appointment? In other words, did President Zuma place any expectation on how you would conduct yourself as Minister of Finance?
No. I think the urgency was just to get my appointment done and the public informed so that whatever effects were anticipated for Monday the 14th would begin to take place.
Yes. You deal later with a further conversation you had with the President, but just to deal with certain speculation, if I may, that certain conditions were placed by the former President or certain demands were made or a deal was done. What is your response to that?
Yes, no, thank you for raising that, and if I may take a few liberties in this regard, because
Thank you.
speculations either within the Commission or outside is a poor substitute for facts from me appearing right before you. So the first point I want to make is that I was surprised that he was asking me and that others were asking me to take this job again. Having just been removed in 2014 from this position of Minister of Finance. Secondly, I've never lobbied for any job, including this one. So let me make it very clear. And this is linked to the point I want to make. For me, politics is not a career. I'm not tied to earning my income by being a member of parliament or by being a cabinet minister. It was a calling. And one can walk out and look for a job elsewhere if the need arises. So that's the third point. The fourth is that I didn't actually want to change jobs. We were just beginning to get to terms with the difficulties that municipalities were facing. We had developed an analytical methodology, chairperson at the time, which Minister Mkhize inherits today. And that enabled us to understand which were the functional municipalities, which were the dysfunctional municipalities, and which municipalities, as the third group, would have some hope if we intervened in a technical sense. We also spent a lot of time visiting municipalities and understanding what goes wrong in places that do go wrong, whether it's Utsoran at that point in time, or Makolokwena in Limpopo, or other places in the country as well. So what was a fairly dysfunctional department was beginning to come together, and the back to basics concept was created. The president had actually, I can't remember the date, but addressed a back to basics conference of mayors and speakers and so on, and municipal managers prior to this particular occasion arising. So, and all of that was in order, let me be frank, to place the ANC in a position where in the 2016 municipal elections it would do better than it would have otherwise. So that was certainly the intention. So in that sense, I didn't want to actually get into changing jobs at that point in time. The point that relates more directly to what Mr. Pretorius asks chairperson is that I don't make deals for jobs. I don't need to. I have my own humble beginnings as just a pharmacist. I think in 1974, my first salary was 100 rands or 125 rands. That looks funny today, but that's where we started. And certainly I don't make deals with smugglers or taxpayers or submit to intimidation or bullying of any kind. The last point I want to make in this regard is that as far as I'm concerned, I'm accountable to citizens of this country, as you pointed out yesterday, who actually elect us into Parliament. Then Parliament as an institution, because I'm an executive in this government. Of course, I'm accountable to the political organization that has enabled me to play this kind of role, but I'm not accountable to bullies in any way whatsoever. And I believe, if I may take the liberty to say so, Chair, that those who are making the accusations that they are, or these allegations, either outside of this forum or elsewhere, should, under oath, come to commissions like this one, and this one in particular, and say what they have to say, and subject themselves to cross-examination if need be. I've appeared before your colleague, former Judge Nugent, said what I had to say under oath there. I'm appearing before you and saying what I have to say under oath, and I'm not fearful of any contradiction in that regard. So thank you for the opportunity just to clarify those issues.
Thank you.
I'm not a commodity for sale. And I think the Guptas learned that too.
Minister, the conversation continued, or a different conversation followed, where you raised certain issues with the former president. What was the context of that discussion, and what was the content of that discussion?
Yeah, I'm just trying to track that paragraph.
You're dealing with paragraph 88.
88. So, Chair, as the in the paragraph before that indicates, I said my first response to the President was, as I indicated, you have other people you could appoint to this position. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I also might have said, and I did say, by the way, well, you moved me in the first place from the job, so why do you want me back there? And then I said I needed to consult my family, which I did. And despite our collective reluctance, we said the country being where it is and the kind of difficulties that we're facing, let's give the commitment to serve in this capacity again, which we did. And when I finally communicated to the President that I would accept his proposition, I said there are 3 issues which we need to discuss. They weren't discussed that evening, but I put them on the table. The first is as I indicated in 88.1, the ongoing dire financial predicament of SAA, and specifically the role of the chair of the board, Ms. Mieni. Now, you'll recall that SAA up to the 2014 elections was within the public enterprises portfolio. He had hinted during that period, slightly before the elections, that he wants to transfer it to Treasury to sort it out. I think there were some difficulties between Minister Gigaba and Ms. Mieni, which I think is on the record publicly as well. Secondly, I think Minister Nene might have indicated to you that the SAA is then transferred to Treasury during his term post the 2014 elections. So thirdly, if I get back to Treasury, I'm inheriting SAA and the kind of difficulties that SAA has on the one hand, but particularly the role of the chair on the other hand. 88.2 is the second item, which I indicated that we needed to discuss, which yesterday I showed that the conversation started before the 2014 elections, and that is the proposed nuclear procurement deal. And the concern there was a very similar one as the one I expressed on that occasion, which is, can we have a proper procurement process, and can we ensure that fiscally we can afford whatever it is that we agree to purchase in the nuclear field, but obviously recognizing, as I said yesterday, that there are various providers on the one hand and stakeholders like environmental groups and civil society organizations on the other hand. The third was the issue of Mr. Moyane's role as the SARS commissioner, and this arises from the fact that I think from about the last quarter of 2014 and into 2015, you've had a number of leaks to the Sunday Times in particular, for which they've subsequently apologized, in relation to an investigation unit that was set up within the Revenue Service, which Judge Nugent has been looking at, but in a much broader context. So those were the 3 issues, Mr. Pretorius, that I indicated we needed to chat further. He nodded his head and said, yes, we'll talk about it.
So apart from placing those issues on the agenda, as it were any substantive agreements reached or understandings reached about how those problems would be addressed?
No. I was anticipating that at least having placed these issues on the table, that at some stage or the other we would begin to talk about them in a systematic way. Some we did, some we didn't, in the short period thereafter.
At page 425 of the bundle is the press release that was issued. You've already dealt with that. I understand from your statement that you assisted in the drafting of that statement.
Yeah, my concern and the Treasury officials' concern would have been, if we've got the same printout, the bottom part of page 425. And I think it's perhaps important to look at it carefully. So remember, again, the context, Chairperson, is turmoil, concerns about nuclear, concerns that we might be overstepping the mark in terms of fiscal affordability, and then finally, as a result of Mr. Nene's dismissal, a great concern about the economic management as a whole. So you will see that he will lead the government again in the following: ensuring an even stronger alignment between the budget and the medium-term strategic framework, which I referred to yesterday, in the interest of stimulating more inclusive growth and accelerated job creation, while continuing the work of ensuring that our debt is stabilized over the medium term. Promoting, this is the second bullet point, and promoting and strengthening the fiscal discipline and prudence that has characterized our management of public finances since the dawn of freedom. Third bullet point, working with the financial sector so that its stability is preserved under the broad umbrella of the Twin Peaks reform. And fourth, ensuring that the National Treasury is more acceptable to all sections of our society. And adherence to the set expenditure ceiling while maintaining a stable trajectory of our debt portfolio as set out in the February 2015 budget. So if you go through that, Chair, and these were some of the issues that I covered yesterday, you will recall. The first bullet point is the alignment, if I may explain, between the budget and the medium-term strategic framework, which is crafted on the basis of the governing party's manifesto once an election is over. And clearly the key concern in that period, because by 2015, growth was beginning to decline. We had a sharp downturn, 2009-10 and part of 11, slight uptick thereafter, and then a decline again, which we've never quite recovered from. And that's why the emphasis on more inclusive growth, and clearly in our context where we have such high unemployment, accelerated job creation would be quite important as well. But equally important in the last of the line, on the last or the second last line of the first bullet point, and you'll notice we make reference to debt twice, right? So there we talk about our debt is stabilized over the medium term, meaning that for a while the debt curve, and if you look at the budget reviews, you'll see graphs that reflect this, the debt curve has been moving that way. And what we're saying is that it needed to taper off before you get anywhere near 60%, as I was explaining yesterday.
On the face of it, this part that you have just talked to now would reasonably be expected to mean that when it came to is it the energy deal? When it came to that therefore your view about costs would be given due weight.
Yes.
Thank
well,
you.
In this context, it had to be.
Yeah. Okay.
It had to be. So if you look at the second point, Chair, promoting and strengthening the fiscal discipline and prudence. So there was already concern amongst rating agencies and so on. And it's a point that is picked up on the next page when we refer to the expenditure ceiling. So we've created a concept or a virtual ceiling, if you like, as government, not as but on Treasury's proposal, which says that don't try to cross the, I think it's the 30% barrier. And whatever you want to do within that envelope that's actually available. And that provided a lot of assurance to bond investors and others that we were maintaining an appropriate fiscal trajectory whilst attending to whatever the issues were that we were facing at the time. And the emphasis on prudence would be with reference to issues like nuclear on the one hand, but a general mindset in terms of how we spend the money and resources that we have. And the third bullet point is work with the financial sector. And the importance here is that the financial sector is the sector that gets, was firstly fairly secure during the after effects or the ripples that we had from the Wall Street Great Recession beginning to impact on the rest of the world. And as I indicated yesterday, that a rising from the experience of the financial crisis, there was a G20 discussion and process which said that the way in which the financial sector is regulated needs to change, and that began to introduce the Twin Peaks concept, the Twin Peaks policy document, and today we actually have legislation in place as well. So there's been, for example, an insurance company that's been in the news for the last 48 to 72 hours. Its prudential regulation is now, as I said yesterday, under the Reserve Bank, but its market conduct, that means the way in which it behaves towards customers, is part of this new body, I forget its name now, which is a successor to the Financial Services Board. And ensuring the National Treasury is more acceptable, I think arises from the fact that sometimes we had detractors who would undermine the credibility of the Treasury, and it is in these instances where external investors and businesses generally, small and big, would be looking for signals of stability by looking at what happens in the Treasury environment. So instability in the Treasury, politically or otherwise, sends the wrong kind of signals about how we're managing the resources in our country. And the last bullet point on page 426 refers to what I said earlier on the expenditure ceiling and maintaining a stable trajectory of debt, so that debt is mentioned for the second time. In other words, we made certain undertakings in the February budget of 2015, we'll stick to it. And that's the commitments that help to reassure South Africans and investors that we were doing the right thing.
You've touched on it, Minister, in your last portion of your current answer. It may be assumed that the same or similar principles of fiscal discipline were being followed by your predecessor, Minister Nene at the time, before his dismissal. What was the purpose of the statement then, just generally, in relation to the current situation at the time in December 2015, and of the reassurances?
Well, this is not... there was another statement which perhaps we must look for, which is relevant to your question as well, which is not covered here, which is the reason given for Mr. Nene's dismissal, which he would have covered in his evidence, that he was going to be assigned to a BRICS job. There was no such job. I was one of the initiators of the BRICS Bank concept and the institution, so there was absolutely not a job which is commensurate with what someone like Mr. Nene has to actually offer within the BRICS Bank, or what is called the New Development Bank today. So that's the first. The second is what the latter part of the statement. Because remember, the purpose of bringing about the changes on the 13th of December was to help to reassure markets on Monday, the 14th of December. And so that's the kind of statement that a president needs to issue, to say, I've got the situation under control, this new minister is going to do exactly what we have been doing and have been promising to do, and that's the explicit message. But the implicit message is, as you were saying, Chair, that we're not going to blow the budget on nuclear or any such project.
I know that you did suggest other names when you were approached for reappointment as Minister of Finance, but it just seems to me that it made perfect sense to reappoint somebody who had been to the portfolio, and you had been there for a full 5 years, I think, full 5 years, and the markets knew your views, they knew you, and also, I guess, in this kind of situation, nobody would want somebody who must come in and still learn You needed somebody that really knew what needed to be done. I know that you might find that you are not able to say anything about this, but it seems to me that it made sense if the situation was to be stabilized urgently.
Well, let's take it as academic speculation, Chair, but you could have recalled Mr. Manuel, who was the longest-serving finance minister, I think, in the world at one stage of 13 years.
But had he not left on the basis that he had served too long?
Yeah. Then you've had Mr. Jonas, who was then the deputy minister. So he already understood what that ministry was doing and what the Treasury was doing. And I think they had already crossed one budget cycle plus the MTBPS of 2015. That would have been October 2015. And have been very much into the preparations for budget 2016 by the time these events unfolded. And as I said, Mr. Moleketi was there for a full, well, most of a term, not a full term, as I recall it, because he departed at the same time as Mr. Mbeki. But academically, those were possibilities.
Thank you.
Minister Gordhan, what did you do as your first tasks? What were the first tasks that you performed on your reappointment? You deal with that in paragraph 92.
So that's Monday morning, Chair. Well, first thing before Monday was that I informed the DG in the Treasury that I would be coming in. And I informed the DG in COCTA that I would be leaving as a courtesy. And possibly the deputy ministers in the COCTA environment, but I'm not too clear on that. But I think I met them on Monday morning. So as I indicate in paragraph 92, those were some of the interactions I've had. In 92.1 is with Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. Jonas, to discuss the urgent and significant tasks that we faced, the National Treasury team, so that I could be briefed on the preparations for the 2016 budget, as I indicated earlier on, Mr. Moyane at SARS, regarding 10 issues which I considered important, and they covered in an email which he sent to me on the basis of our discussion. That's at Annexure 19 and at page 428 of the first bundle. And then, as a courtesy, met Minister Van Rooyen, I think after he was sworn in, to give him a very brief oversight on what's happening in COCTA, so that he could adapt to the new environment. The first 2 points are quite important here, 92.1 and 92.2. As I explained, the preparations for a budget technically start in about July, August each year, when officials start interacting or set out the parameters, following a discussion in a subcommittee of cabinet called the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, MINCOM-BUD as we refer to it. And departments then receive a circular which says these are the parameters within which the next budget cycle is possibly going to operate. For example, we might even tell them at that stage, you've got to restrain your expenditure on personnel or whatever the case might be in order to prepare them in respect of their numbers. But inevitably, you always get an oversubscribed set of requests. If your budget is R1 trillion, it could be oversubscribed by about 300 to 400 billion rands, and then the tough task of managing the allocations process as well. Secondly, at about this time, we begin to look at the decision that South Africans often look forward to but don't like, which is tax. So what are the options on the tax side? So you'll recall yesterday we said that in the framework of the budget, there's the revenue side and there's the expenditure side. So I've described the expenditure side, but the revenue side is quite important. And by this time in December, we might have the most recent numbers from the SARS collections as well, and we wait for the next set of numbers at the end of January to give us a more accurate feel for what the tax receipts are likely to be and what percentage increase year on year we're likely to get. And they could vary around the 9% mark historically. So those tax decisions would be quite important. You know, do you increase VAT or not? Do you establish or set up a new bracket of 45% that I suppose a number of people here fall into and pay? And that occupied us for 2 or 3 years before we made the final decision to actually set up or put in place the 45% bracket. Where else do we find money? So transfer fees, as far as property sales is concerned, is another area that we look at. The other part, which is quite popular, is what would be the excise duty increases in cigarettes or alcohol as well, and what are the new taxes, if any. So from time to time, we would look at whether the carbon tax should be introduced or not introduced. There are positives and negatives on that. An example of a new tax could be a new levy on, for example, the plastic bags that we're now all very familiar with, which brings in 1 or 2 billion rands as well. And so each year, the Minister of Finance has to look into those sorts of issues, which I imagine is currently happening in the Treasury as well. And if you recall, I said that at the last meeting of the 9th of December, the final allocations to departments were not decided, as they usually are, but carried forward to the 13th of January, the first cabinet meeting in the following year. So that left a bit of uncertainty about what the allocations would actually look like. So there were fairly substantial issues that needed to be attended to, and when we come to SAA, we'll pick up on one of the, what shall we call it, procurement issues that we ran into as well.
Mr. Gordhan, we return now to the period which your statement covers, and that is your second term as Minister of Finance, against the background of the original purpose of your evidence, which is to outline those issues or circumstances which were prevalent, which may have been relevant to the appointment and dismissals of ministers, particularly yourself. And you start on page 34 of your statement, of the statement bundle, N1A, with South African Airways. Would you outline the circumstances prevalent in relation to South African Airways at the time? It still, at that time, fell under Treasury, I understand.
Yes.
And it was part of your portfolio.
That's correct. So, Chair, as paragraph 93 indicates, and I'll read some of this onto the record and then explain some of the issues. The financial and governance challenges experienced by SAA in recent years are no doubt well known to the Commission. At the time that I was reappointed Minister of Finance, an immediate priority was dealing with the proposed restructuring of a deal that had been approved by Mr. Nene and Airbus, in terms of which SAA would swap the purchase of 10 A320 aircraft for a lease of 5 330-300 aircraft from Airbus. So this is the famous Airbus swap deal, as we might call it.
What was the rationale of that swap and replacing the original purchase with the swap? Are you able to say?
I can't remember the detail, but I think the one, as you know, a purchase would require an upfront capital outlay, which I don't think we had, and SAA certainly didn't have at that time. And a lease would be payment over a period of time, and many airlines today lease rather than purchase aircraft. But one of the things we're learning, Chair, is that in the context of all the instability and difficulties that SAA is facing, leasing at this stage of a transaction is fine. But one of the conditions that lessors add to any leasing agreement is that when you want to hand the aircraft back, then it must be in the condition you received it in. So you've actually got to spend money refurbishing an aircraft before you return it. So it sounds easy in the first stage because you spend your money over a period of time. Others enter into other kinds of agreements as well, where, as I learned in Singapore recently by talking to some of the agencies there, where you build, and I think some of the bigger airlines in the world, the Middle Eastern ones in particular, have, if you like, a recycling agreement that after every 6 or 7 years, they have an agency to which they give the aircraft and then acquire a new aircraft. And the older aircraft is then either sold or leased on, and because they are big buyers of aircrafts, they can have particular deals with Airbus or Boeing or whatever the case might be. But the point I want to make here is that in the current debates that we are having, this is one of the cost factors that needs to be taken into account.
As I understand from the evidence of Mr. Nene, the original agreement required the payment of large pre-delivery amounts, and as a result of the swap to a lease agreement, the airline then would be excused from making those payments.
Yeah, there was an amount of $40 million.
Yes. You deal with that in paragraph 94,
which we come to in a moment.
You should deal with it there.
At paragraph 94, the then chairperson of SAA, Ms. Mieni, however, wished to amend the swap transaction to allow SAA to purchase the aircraft and enter into a sale and leaseback deal with local businesses.
Now, we've been curious to try and discover who those businesses or what those businesses were. Do you have any knowledge of those businesses?
No, but I think we can find out, Chair, from SAA, not offhand. But essentially, this is that same concept I described yesterday in relation to SAA Technical, where a interlocutor, if you like, or middle person is put into the supply chain process. Although here, in a different way. Now imagine you buy the aircraft, you then lease it, and then bring it back onto your service, and you pay all the costs that are involved, including the profit that the lessor in this case would actually make out of this process as well. So I'm sure there's a forensic report lying around somewhere which would explain potential malfeasance in this particular instance as well. But it meant, as Mr. Pretorius points out, and I'll come to it in a moment.
I just wanted to go back to this condition that the aircraft, when you have leased it, must be returned in the condition that it was in when you leased it. Would that have been subject to normal wear and tear? Because otherwise, it just seems to me it's rather unfair on the lessee if it's not subject to normal wear and tear. Means you lease it for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, you give this lessor something that he or she would not have had if the aircraft had stayed with them.
So I think some things are allowable, if you like, and some things have to be returned to the original condition. But we can get you the details if you're interested.
Okay, all right.
Minister, do you have any detail of the sale and lease agreement? It's described as a sale and lease back deal. Presumably the aircraft would be purchased by SAA, on-sold to local businesses, and then leased back to SAA. Are there any further details as to...
I'm sure the Treasury chairperson would have the details. So the proposed pre-delivery payments, which we referred to a moment ago, of approximately $40 million and approximately 603 million rands at that time, under that proposal would likely have triggered debt defaults by SAA because they wouldn't have had that kind of cash available to them. Due to the pressure these payments would have placed on SAA's cash resources, cross defaults on other leasing arrangements and the probable triggering of government-guaranteed debt obligations would likely have followed.
Was that the circumstance you explained yesterday of cross guarantees?
That's, yeah, that's the point I was going to make in a moment, that once you trigger those cross defaults, then it begins to affect all the other lending agreements that you might have entered into. This would have had severe consequences for SAA and the country as a whole. So if you take this as a package, there's a fairly responsible decision taken to undertake the swap. We didn't have the money to pay the $40 million at the time, or SAA didn't have the money. Despite that, they were trying to pursue the sale and leaseback scheme that would have had its own cost implications as well, and that potentially, if sufficient regard was not had to the amount of cash available to SAA to pay these amounts, then you would get into that cross-default situation that government obviously doesn't want to find itself in. At 95, in late December 2015, while driving on the N2 highway in Cape Town, I received a phone call from the former president inquiring whether we could do what Ms. Mieni wanted with respect to the Airbus deal. I explained that we could not, since the fiscus could not afford the pre-delivery payments, and the penalties would follow if we undertook her proposal. It was clear to me that Ms. Mieni had contacted the former president and that had prompted his call to me. 96, I afforded SAA the opportunity to make further representations to National Treasury regarding Ms. Mieni's proposal, following which I decided in late December 2015 that the swap transaction should go ahead as had been approved by Mr. Nene in July 2015. Prior to my appointment as Minister of Finance, the National Treasury had been working on the process of appointing a new SAA board, as outlined in Mr. Nene's statement to the Commission. Progress was slow, and I understand that eventually the engagements between officials from the Presidency and from National Treasury produced a list of individuals to be appointed to the board. A compromise was reached that Ms. Mieni would only continue as chairperson of the board for a further year. So there's, in relation to the swap arrangement, chairperson, despite the fact that we were quite convinced in the Treasury that this was heading in the wrong direction, we gave SAA the opportunity to make representations to persuade the Treasury that they would have had the money and that the kind of scheme that they wanted to enter into was one that would not be detrimental to both SAA and the state.
Who made those representations? Was it SAA board, SAA executive?
Again, I don't have the details. I was on semi-leave at the time, so the officials at the Treasury dealt with that. I think Mr. Mamoniat was acting Director General during that period. But I somehow recall also that I had to speak to the Airbus people directly in Paris to reassure them, because we were heading for some kind of deadline, by which time we had to make up our minds on the swap agreement. And just to assure them that there was a process underway, and it might have been very close to the 20th or so of December, by which time a letter was formally sent to them that we agree with the swap agreement and not any other alternative. And they were quite willing to accept our reassurances.
That last sentence in paragraph 97, a compromise was reached, suggests that there may have been some among those who may have been talking who wanted Ms. Mieni to not to continue, but there may have been others who wanted her to continue. Am I right? And are you able to talk on that?
No, you're right, and I was going to come back to 97 as a whole, Chair, to explain both that and the fact that this sounds very smooth in 97, but it's a process, as I recall it, and I was reading this in one of the transcripts that the Commission had provided with the previous public protector. This took about 6 to 7 months. So for 6 months at least, we had paralysis because the President and the Treasury had different views about who would constitute the board. Largely, I think on the other side, led by Ms. Miani's own approach to who she would prefer on the board. And eventually, this discussion that we indicate here between the presidency officials and National Treasury officials brought together, if you like, 2 lists and gave us the board that emerged. And then you're correct, this last sentence does reflect the fact that there was some debate about whether Ms. Miani continues at all as a member of the board or whether she continues for the next 3 years as a chair of the board, and then the compromise of 1 year emerged in that context.
The matter is dealt with in documents in the supplementary bundle, and perhaps we can address those after the short adjournment with the leave of the chair. Thank you.
We'll take the tea adjournment. We'll resume at 11:30.